Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Preview of the episodes 41 to 44, The Meaning of Meaning. Episode 41, Quantum Esotericism. If you begin to study physics and, for example, at university or by reading books or however you engage with this topic, you will soon realize that there is not only this scientific side to it, but that there are many people who think about physics or science in general in a very different way, in a more kind of like esoteric way. And this has, in some sense, historic reasons, because, for example, for a long time, mysticism, if you like to call it that way, and science or physics were closely connected. For example, astronomy used to be, or astrology used to be a part of astronomy, and they were reading in the stars and trying to make prediction about the future from that, and even early scientists like Johannes Kepler were still doing such things, although at this time the scientific method was already developing and putting an end to that kind of thing. But you can see from there that this esotericism was in the beginning closely connected to science, and in many cultures science came about just to be able to make predictions about the future, which in most times were not predictions about, okay, when will the moon rise again, or when will the sun rise again, or things like that, which would be really scientific. Also these things, but also other things like, okay, the stars, which positions do the stars have, and what does this say about our future, about our current state of our society? Are we in favor of the gods, and so on? All these things used to be part of or used to be a broader part of something that you could call ancient science, or how the ancients did science. And only when the scientific method was developed, we gradually moved ourselves from this kind of science as part of something else which is not scientific at all, to something which is really science, which is really based on the scientific method and not on some other things. And so this was separated, but still these ideas, these mystic ideas, the esotericism is still around. Spirituality, spiritual thinking about the universe, our world, and so on. This is still around, and many of people who are esoterics or who are spiritual or consider themselves to be spiritual, they kind of engage in these topics, and when they look at science, they are oftentimes also fascinated by science, but they look at this from that perspective, which oftentimes yields different results, and unfortunately it oftentimes yields results that are not really scientifically accurate. Not just that they have some other interpretation of it or something, some other way of seeing or looking at it, they really have results that are clearly not scientific at all, that contradict everything science has to tell us. And the more you dive into especially modern physics topics, the more you will realize this, so it's especially present in quantum mechanics. And there is, therefore, I often call these kind of engagements of these people in science, I often call it quantum esotericism, because that's basically what it is. It's using science, or taking statements of science and tries to interpret in an esoteric or in a spiritual way, which is in general not wrong. I mean, oftentimes on my podcast I do the same, but I think it's really important to stay close to the facts and to not go away from the scientific facts and stay accurate there. And I hope on my podcast I really try to do this. So I hope I manage to do so, and I really try to stay close to the facts and not say something about science which is not true, or interpret something into it which is not there. But oftentimes if one engages in these topics, many people do not are not able to do that, or are not focused on doing that, and this is the pity of it. And since many of those always use, especially when they are dealing with quantum mechanics, they oftentimes use some new terms that they kind of invented or got somewhere where you don't really know where they got them from, and put a quantum in front of it and make it look like it is something scientific and so on. For example, quantum healing and so things like this. And because of them using this quantum as a buzzword for any kind of nonsense, I often call this quantum esotericism. And recently there was also someone who was discussing this on a podcast. It's Terrence Howard. He is an actor, also known for Marvel movies. For example, I think he was in the first Iron Man movie. And he was on Joe Rogan, and he was discussing his kind of theory of the universe, or what he was thinking about scientific topics. And you did not need to watch the whole thing to really know that there is not a lot of real science in there, or that there are contradictory things that from the outset are completely nonsense. For example, one thing he seems to have said is that 1 times 1 instead of 1 being actually 2, which just is not right. It's not that this is some calculation that could have been done wrong up to now and he got the right result. No, it's a matter of definition. So the 1 in mathematics is defined especially as something that leaves the thing with which you multiply it unchanged. So if I multiply 7 times 1, the 1 is defined such that I have to get 7 again. And if I multiply 1 by 1, it is defined as such that I get the same, so that I get 1. By definition, it is the case. So it's not that until now mathematicians were calculating everything wrong. They miscalculated, and he found out now it's really that mathematics is, except the construct of mathematics, is defined such that 1 times 1 is 1. And therefore, if this would not be true, the whole concept of mathematics would break down. And it's not even a question if it is true or if it's not true, because it's axiomatically defined as such. So it's the building block of the whole method, or one of the building blocks of the whole mathematic construct. So it's not about is it right, is it not right. It's defined this way. So this is the starting block from which mathematics proceeds. So this is completely wrong to state it like this, and therefore you can here already see that there are a lot of mistakes, or that is through and through filled with mistakes or a wrong understanding of science and mathematics itself. And therefore, when this came out and achieved some or was going viral in the internet, many scientists and physicists were reacting to it, and most of the discussion revolved around the topic, okay, how do we deal with this? Should we engage in it? Should we disprove all his theses, or should we just ignore it, and so on? But I really do not want to dive deeper into that question. I found on some other page, I found a question which I found was much more interesting, especially for this podcast episode. And this is the question of, wow, why are these things so popular? I think so when I started learning about physics and I came in contact with these quantum esotericism books and interpretations and so on, I was not really at that point, I did not know that much about science, that much about physics. So I could not, from a factual standpoint, see that what they were writing about was factually wrong. But I kind of knew it. And that does not sound right. That seems fishy and so on. So I kind of knew that this is wrong, but they couldn't tell you from scientific facts or from what I knew about physics that it actually is wrong. So the question is, if I could sense that, can also other people who are not deep into science, who do not know a lot about scientific facts and so on, can they also see that, or do they believe that that's just the truth because they don't know any better? And I think there are both kinds of people. Some really do believe this is true, but I think most really can sense, no, something's not really right about that. But still, some of those are drawn to these theories or to these ideas. And I think the question that we have to ask is why that is. How can this be? And I think the answer is that although we know that most of it is scientifically wrong, most of it is factually wrong, we know that there is something to it that has some truth in it. There is something true about it, although it's not true in a scientific sense. And what do I mean by that? So if we look into the history, we had it so we talked in recent episodes about the scientific method, how it was developed, how it came about, and what the impact of it was, and also, as I believe, that it came from naturalistic theology, which was the source of this development of the scientific method. But what was there before, as I also already showed in some sense, was this mysticism, which was kind of a combination of science and all these other spiritual ideas, also superstitions and these things. And when the scientific revolution began, when the Reformation also began, there was this process of, one calls it today, the disenchantment, where all these superstitious beliefs and all these things were put apart, and we only focused on what is factually true, what can be observed in science, what we can see in our experiments, and what we can therefore also confirm with our experiments. And all these other things were pushed aside. And the idea is, or what many times oftentimes afterwards was criticized on this, is that by that kind of that we were pushing out a baby with the bathwater. That okay, there were these superstitions and all this stuff. This was not good. This was leading people to doing stupid things, as we now know. But there was something that we lost by putting it all out, because there was something that was true to, or some elements of it might have been true, or some, not the superstitions themselves, but the belief in general, believing in some higher powers, believing in a God, for example, and believing in a world that, in a spiritual world that beyond the materialistic world, that there something was true about it. And this has been lost when all this superstitious stuff and all this, everything that is not predicted by the scientific method and so on, when this was put apart, that something was lost by it, and also some sense for it. So some, for example, in a later movement, the Romantics, they were pretty much against this scientificized world, if you can call it that. So this world of science, where only science was matter, only reason, only facts was of matter, and they were arguing for beauty and truth, for truth and beauty, as Percy Shelley put it, where both things are connected, where there's also some truth in the beauty that you see in this world. So I mean, this were mostly poets. They were writing poetry, so they were in beauty. They were finding a truth that they saw not to be reflected in science. And they said, okay, when I look at a flower, there is some sense of beauty that I can see it, that I cannot describe scientifically, but that is still there and that still has a truth to it. And so they were arguing for another, maybe a more emotional level, beyond the the visible beyond the materialistic, beyond the reasonable level, that they argued is still true, although it might seem subjective and not really there. Or they also were arguing that kind of this subjective, although it is subjective, there's still something real to it. And Feynman, for example, when he was arguing with an artist about this, or about the idea that there was an artist and he said he can see a flower, the beauty of a flower more than a scientist can. The scientist can only see the naturalistic effects that a flower that produces the flower, photosynthesis and so on, and he can see the real beauty of it. And Feynman was arguing basically that this is not true, that the scientist can see even more than it, because the scientist can see the beauty of the flower and he can see it in a scientific form, and therefore he can see basically the full beauty, because he not only understands or sees the beauty of the flower, but he also understands why it is beautiful, what are the naturalistic effects behind it, and so on. And I think to some degree that might be true, but I think also that in some sense this romantic idea was right, that there is something beyond the scientific world that can be sensed, that has a truth to it, that is true, and therefore only limiting ourselves to scientific facts will in the end not lead to the full truth. And what you can see from there is also what has been lost in this disenchantment is not just a feeling of beauty or a sense of beauty or something like that, but also a sense for connectedness, for unity, for the whole, so the thing as a whole. Because you can see, if you just look to some things many of these quantum esoterics say, is oftentimes they are talking about a connectedness of the world and a oneness of the world as a whole, and so on. And there you can see this longing for a complete explanation, a oneness, getting things done as a whole, seeing things as a whole, seeing the connections between everything. And science in this way has taken a completely different path, because science was beginning to analyze things and to reduce things to its foundational parts, and then trying to find out how those work, and say basically, okay, later we can put it all together again, and then we will understand the whole thing, because we understand each individual part of it. And this is, for example, in medicine, they at some point started to cut open corpses and see, okay, where are the organs, which organs are there, how do they seem to function, what can I see in there, and so on. So they reduced the body to its individual parts and try to understand them individually in order to understand the whole thing. And in physics, we basically do the same thing. We started to go all the smaller particles, to particles, so atoms, then electrons, protons, neutrons, and quarks, and so on. And if we go up to string theory, then we have individual strings, and so on. So we went to these foundational particles in order to understand how this whole system of particles, of parts, works together. And as we talked about in one of the last episodes about emergence, we have already seen there that this process, as powerful as it is, there are some limitations of it. There are effects occurring that we cannot see if we just look at these foundational building blocks, but there are things that are emerging if many of these building blocks come together, interact together, and we cannot really understand how this works out, how it comes that these emergent effects, how they emerge, how they come together. And here we already see that by reducing ourselves to this analytical process, to reducing the system more and more and more, we lost something, and this only emerges if we put the system back together. And I think this is basically what is also happening here, that by just focusing on materialism, we basically got lost of the things that are beyond that. And I think we can see this in science also in the fact that we cannot really understand what consciousness is, or in different areas where we do not really understand different phenomena of science, because there is something emerging which is beyond the area of science, beyond the area of this materialistic world, because there's also the spiritual world which is interacting with it. And I think to put it in a scriptural sense, or to look what scripture has to say about it, because I really believe the thing that was lost, or you have to say, I really believe that the scientific revolution was a good thing, and it had to happen, and it needed to happen, and it was about to happen at some point, because if you just look at how they were doing science then, because all this this phase of disenchantment was starting, it got really difficult to do their kind of science, which still was fitting with their unity approach and so on, what they learned from Aristotle and so on, because instead of overthrowing what he has said, they were just trying to fix all the data they had to this ideas and so on. So it was pretty tedious if you just look at how they were calculating the star movement with all their epicycles and so on. It was a complete mess, but it was necessary in order to keep this system in place. So I think it was really necessary that a scientific revolution came, and it made many things a lot easier. But as I said, through this disenchantment, many things got lost, and many of those things that got lost, it was for many things it was a good thing that it was lost. It was good to lose these superstitions and so on, but some parts of this real existing spiritual world, that they have been lost. This was, I think, a loss for all, and therefore I think the only way to put it together, to get to this unity again, is not to believe in some quantum esotericism, but actually to look in the scripture for help and for guidance. And I think there's also a scripture that can help us with this, and this is, for example, in Hebrews 4 verse 12. There it says, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." So here it says that the word is actually this dividing force, this sharper than a double-edged sword. It penetrates between soul and spirit. So in faith we believe that that man is a being that is spirit, that has a soul and is living in a body. So soul are your feelings and your thoughts and so on, and spirit is the part with which you can communicate to God. And the body is the thing in which you live, the material part of you, so to speak. And this is basically the worldview, the Christian worldview, and it says that the word of God is dividing between that, and this is, of course, we are one. We are not we are spirit. We are living in a soul, and we have a body, but it's also our body, and we have the soul. This is all, you can separate it by the word, yeah, but it is all one. And I think what this scripture shows us is that the word can separate between and judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart, so we can distinguish between what's really from us and what are other things and so on. We can really distinguish there. Also in the sense of this world where we want to separate superstition from real beliefs, you can get this also through the word. I think this is also what the scripture is telling us. And I think you can see here that the word is really the guiding line. We can really use the word of God as a guiding line to find this division, or this dividing between soul and spirit, where we really know which is which. And also in science, where we know, okay, what is scientific, what is a spiritual fact, which we can not prove scientifically, but which is still true, where there's still some truth to it, and which are just superstitions. I think we can get this really through the word of God, and I think this is really the way to go. This is the solution that God has provided for us to really have this discernment discernment of which things we can put aside and which things we need to keep to have this complete picture of the world, the complete truth, the full truth, and the full truth that, as the word tells us, is only found in Jesus, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So I think if we focus on this and if you look into this, then we can really get this whole picture. Then we can get this truth out of science, where we know, okay, due to the scientific method, we can really check our data and see that these things are true. But the stuff that is beyond that we cannot prove scientifically, but where we know there has to be some truth to it, or at least some parts of it have to be truth, and this truth needs to be also confirmed, or it needs to be also found, and this is found through the Word of God, where we can trust on the discernment of the Word of God, that the Word of God gives us, guided by the Holy Spirit. Episode 42, Machine Learning. In times of AI, artificial intelligence and so on, it's more and more important to understand how machines really work, how machines do really learn, what is meant by artificial intelligence, what is meant by machine learning, how does it work, and so on. And artificial intelligence, there is no clear definition of it. There are different definitions of it. One problem of it is also that the intelligence itself is not clearly defined what this really is. However, machine learning can be defined in a much more clear way, or understood in a much more clear way, because you can really understand the process of what is done there, what happens there, and mostly it's about really how can machines basically learn to solve certain problem or to do a certain task in a way which is not just a simple algorithm, but in a way which is interpreting data, basically. So to understand this, I think have to think back to school. I'm not sure if you did this in school, but in school we had this part where we had several points, for example, drawn in a coordinate system, and we needed to find a curve which would fit the data to this curve. So, for example, you would have wanted to draw a straight line between 2 points. This you could easily do. There's no deviation between it, because 2 points you can always connect with a straight line. However, let's say you don't have 2 points, but you have 4 points, and they are not exactly on a straight line, but they are kind of on a straight line. So you assume that this behavior is following a straight line, and the deviations are just some measurement errors or something like this. And doing this to get the line which perfectly describes these data points is more difficult. But how do you do it? So I mean, the most reasonable approach is basically to try different straight lines. So as you know, the function for a straight line is basically m times x plus b. So where m and b are parameters, so m is the slope and b is the offset, and x is of course the variable. And if you can then now you can vary these parameters m and b, so the slope and the offset, to find the different kind of straight lines. And if you do this, you can always say, okay, from the data points that I have, I measure just the distance to the value of x at this straight line, and then I reduce this value to be as small as possible, so that the distances from each measurement point are as close, as small as possible. This is basically your goal, and this you can do by some algorithms, or you can do it in your head by trying, which might be a bit tedious at some time, but by now there are many tools that can do this. For example, our calculator even could do such things, and then you can basically see how good your fit is, and have the the straight line which best describes your data. You can also do this for, of course, other functions, for parabolas of different Mach order, and therefore there you can see also how you can fit these points in there. And this is also, if you begin to study physics, especially on the experimental side, this will be kind of your daily bread, trying to fit data points to some function, some curve or something. And there are many ways to do this. There are many techniques about to do this, and also to interpret the data, to know how good is your fit, to have statistical values that describe the goodness of your fit. And what's important to know, I mentioned already, you can say, okay, if there are deviations between these points, you can call those errors or measurement errors. And what you do in physics is then, of course, you try them as bars. So you say, okay, it's not this one point, my measurement value, because I account for the fact that I have not measured this data perfectly, but there are some errors on this. And then I can, even if I try to draw those bars, then I can also check how accurate my curve is, not only by whether it passes exactly through the point, which would basically be nonsense, but whether it is in the area of these error bars. And these are techniques to check how good your fit is and so on. So this is really relevant in science, but it's also relevant in everyday problems, and also more importantly in problems that this machine learning tries to solve. Because this, what I described before, if you do this with a with some calculator, with some device, with some computer, you will basically be doing a kind of machine learning already. So it's a pretty primitive kind, but it's already a computer who is learning how to fit the data, basically. And machine learning is actually not much more complicated than that from its basic principle. It is more complicated in the methods it uses and in the kind of data it tries to fit, because machine learning usually does not have just one variable, x in the case of these functions, that it tries to where it tries to get a fit for, but several variables, because of that it's also often called multivariate analysis. This is also often meant, or if people talk about multivariate analysis, the kind of analysis they do are most connected to some machine learning algorithms. So in this case, you not only have x, but you have several variables, y, z, and so on. And this these are just cases where several variables need to be accounted for. So let's just take an example. Let's think, for example, about housing costs. So let's say you have a house and you want to just know for how much can I sell this house that I have. And there are many things that are relevant for it. First, you might think, okay, my house has this size, another house is of the same size, so the price should be equal, right? But it could be, for example, that your house is much more modern than this other house, and therefore you could say, I can really my house has more value or is more valuable than this one because it's more modern. Another thing could be that the house of the other person maybe is directly in the city while yours is more remotely. This could mean then that the other house is more value because of its location. Its location is more to the center or more urban and so on, and therefore the price increases. So you see here, for the costs of a house, there are many variables that are relevant to know what the price of the house is. And more than that, it's not just the variables that are relevant, it's that they are weighted differently. I mean, you can think that maybe the location is more important than for the house price is maybe more important than how modern the house is, or it's the other way around, whatever. So there's also this weight that you need to apply, and therefore to find the right price for your house might be really difficult. And here machine learning methods are about to help, but because these are doing these multivariate analyses. And what is done there is most oftentimes one method that is used there, which is often talked about, are these so-called neural networks. So they are trying to mimic the neurons in our brain, and they do this by having different layers. And they have an input layer where the data with this many variables that it can have is put in. So these are fixed data values. So you can imagine for our house pricing example, those are really houses where the price is known. And the price is known, and also it is known how modern is the house, where is it located, and so on. All these different variables, and its its price is known, and then they are put in there, and there are different layers, and then there can be different layers, and in the end there's an output layer which basically gives you the model of how you can, for some a certain house, how you can compute the price for which you could sell it. If there is more than one layer in the intermediate area between the input and the output layer, then you would call this deep learning. This is what's meant if one is talking about deep learning. And what you see now is that there needs to be a model. So you have some model, for example, you have all these variables and you have this weight. This is basically the model that you put in, and then you say, give these data points with all these different variables and the result of it, the price in the end, and then this neural network basically uses the data and uses the data with all these variables and tries to put the weights, which would be the parameters, that it tries to put the weights such that the price of the house can be predicted by this function, by this model. And this it tries for all the data points, and it fixes the parameters again and again such that the differences from it, the error which it then has, where it cannot be completely describe the data, are minimal. That it has the perfect parameters which can describe all the data. And to see how this is connected to the neural network, or how this can be understood, these different layers of the network, is let's think about image recognition. So this is one issue that is used or for which machine learning algorithms are used. And let's, for example, say we want to have a machine learning algorithm, which can tell us whether something on a photo, so I give them some photo and I want this algorithm to tell me if it is a car or if it is something else. And the way I do this is I basically, or what an algorithm, for example, it then does is just illustrated in reality. It would work a bit different, but for example, it would look, okay, are there wheels on it? Are there any wheels? Are there 4 wheels? Are there 2 wheels? How many wheels are there? Are there wheels at all? And then it would say, okay, if there are wheels, this might be a car. If there are 4 wheels, it is pretty certain that it is a car. But now you know, okay, if I go basically if I see an old car which is completely destroyed and there are no wheels anymore on it, I might still call it a car. I might not call it a functioning car, but I might say, yeah, that it's a car because it was built as a car and therefore it kind of is still a car. And therefore, it might not be weighted as highly as if something else, for example. Or you might say, okay, does it have some doors, for example? Yeah, you can say, okay, many cars or most cars do have doors, but there are also cars like you see on a safari, or these kind of cars which you use more for off-road purposes. Some of those do not really have doors or have different kind of doors and so you see there are many differences. So if the algorithm sees that something is there, this not already means that this is definitely a car, but it might mean that this is a car, so it has to put a weight on it, and this weight is what it basically varies. It says, how certain can I be that if I see a picture with four wheels that it is a car? So it puts a weight on that. And then it says, okay, how certain can I be if it has, for example, a steering wheel, that it is a car? Then it puts a weight on that. How certain is it that if I see a door that it is a car? And then it puts a weight on that, and so on. And in the end, it gets fed all this data and tries to put these parameters perfectly to predict if some image that I feed into it is a car or not. And I was now already mentioning how this works, that we feed the data into it. So basically it learns from this data. So we put data into it, data where I say, okay, this is a car, this is not a car, this is a car, this is not a car, and so on. And because the algorithm knows what is what, it can basically tune itself to that and can say, okay, this is a car, and try to put the weights in the right order, and tune its model to the data, and then get perfect this model to it. But what I need to consider there, of course, is when I have done this, and then in the end I have my perfect function which can predict if it's a car or not. If I only have done it this way, this can be pretty critical or pretty bad, because what can happen there is that it is an effect we call overtraining. So it can be that the data is that my algorithm has fitted the function or the prediction function so closely to the data that it does that if I put a new image of a different car or slightly different car into it, that it does not recognize it as a car because it's too closely fitted to this data. If you think back about fitting functions, which we talked about in the beginning, then you can see this also there. So for example, I said we had these 4 data points which are pretty close on a straight line, but I could not connect them perfectly on the straight line. I needed to make a trade-off to put a straight line such that there are some points that I did not catch but are pretty close to it. I could have also said, let's just take a parabola of 4th order, and then I can fit it such that every point is that I get every point of it. But if it is now something where I have these 4 data points and there are different data points in the set which I have not measured, then if it's kind of a straight line, I have to assume that all the other points would also lie on the straight line. And therefore my parabola of 4th order is perfectly describing these 4 data points, but it would be really bad at describing the other points that I have not measured. And this shows also that how some models, some explanation of something can be completely wrong if there's not enough data, or if it's just trained to that data to only fit this and not the stuff that I have not measured yet. And this is the same in machine learning algorithms, where when I do this overtraining, then they are too closely fitted to the data that I feed it into it. And if I then do what I actually wanted to achieve by it, to give it new data and have it predict the outcome of this data correctly, then it will not work because it's too closely fitted to the data or too closely trained to the data that I have given it. And therefore what one does is one separates the data that one has into training data and test data. So usually this is 80-20 or 70-30, but you can take an arbitrary ratio. And the training data is doing what we with the training data, you do what we described before. You just put it in and let the machine learning algorithm basically perfect its model for predicting that what a car is and so on. And what you then do is you put the test data you put it in as real data. So you don't say this is a car, this is not a car, and so on. You do not tell the algorithm. You let it run on it and predict whether the algorithm thinks if it is a car or if it is not a car. And if you then, and from this you can then check how good the algorithm really is, how good you really your model really is. Because if the algorithm says these are all no cars, but there were cars among them, then you know, okay, something went wrong there was some overtraining, and I need to account for that. I need to fix my model, my algorithm, and so on, to account for this fact and to make it less overtraining, and to allow for some room in there that it can really make predictions. So this is basically how machine learning works. This is, of course, just the basics. There is a lot more that goes into it, a lot more that I don't know much about, but this is the basic idea of it, and it's a part of AI, and it's therefore, I think it's also a major part of AI, because many algorithms that you connect to AI these days use it. For example, as we had it, image recognition, speech recognition. This is all some machine learning algorithm that is behind that. And as you can see from this, is also, it is really fitting the data to, or really fitting it to the data that you put in. And it is really believing you that the data that you give it, where you say this is a car, this is not a car, that this is true. So it's really dependent on that. And I think if you think about just the recent things about ChatGPT and these large language models, where it turned out that depending on the questions you ask them, they tend to be lying, and to lying really, really hard and really, really audacious. You can understand why that is, because the data that they find mostly in the internet, they are really usually really certain that this data is the truth, that this really is true, and therefore they are really trusting on this, and therefore they tend to find stuff in the internet which is not true, which they believe to be true, and therefore in a really certain way say this is how it is, or state the facts as they are. And from there you can see that that there is a real problem with this, where this is not really. So you should not really put too much trust in these AI models. And from this, I think you can also see what is still lacking, or what is lacking with these AIs. And this is the kind of what humans are basically used to do, to question these results. To if you have a fit, if you have something and some result that you question, can this really be? Can this work out? Could this be the case? This is not really implemented there, and I think it is also not really possible to implement this all the way along. You can implement it in some way. You can, like we saw with training data and test data, you can get some feel of how accurate it is by the algorithm itself, that it finds it out himself, how accurately he himself is. But this is just just a little bit more closer to that. You cannot, I do not believe that you can get a machine that is really questioning itself like a human would do, because there's just more going into it. I think this is more than just computer algorithms, or more than just processes that are running. I think there's also a spiritual component. That is part of consciousness that is not to be described scientifically, that comes into play there. And I think therefore this cannot, I do not believe that it will be possible to and someday put this into a machine and it will work out perfectly, which shows why I believe also there will always, even though machines will be able to outperform us in speed and in process speed and so on, and in what they can compute, where they already outperform us. They can in nanoseconds, they can compute things that we cannot solve in 100 years maybe, but in another way, In other ways, we are outperforming them in a sense of questioning things, don't taking things as complete truth and so on. So being doubtful and so on. I think or skeptical, and I think in this way we outperform the machines, and I think this will not change, because this, I think, is connected to our consciousness, to the fact that we are conscious beings and self-reflective beings, and I think this you cannot really put into a machine. Okay, time for a short break. And as usual in these breaks, I like to read a short excerpt of my new book or my new novel, Alien Thoughts. Patricia entered her office and sat down at her desk. Exhausted, she closed her eyes and collected herself. When she opened her eyes again, her eyes fell on a photo on her desk. It showed Tom and her just before they had broken up. She wondered why it was still there. Maybe it was because she hardly ever came into this office anymore. She spent most of her time in her office at the headquarters. When she looked closer, she realized how long it had been since she had seen Tom. His face was almost foreign to her. Suddenly, memories came flooding back. She had to think of the moment when they had met for the first time. It had been in this building, one floor below, in the lecture hall where she was giving her lecture this morning. She had been in the audience then. At first she had not liked Tom. He was cheeky and asked questions in every lecture, whether he was called or not. He was not afraid to use a cheeky tone, even in front of lecturers like Boris. She believed that was why Boris had been so disapproving of her relationship with Tom. While she was calmly processing the information and asking the lecturer questions in private after the lecture, Tom was behaving the opposite way. She thought it was rude and did not have a good opinion of Tom. He, on the other hand, was very interested in her. Something about her seemed to fascinate him, although she revealed little of herself in her shy manner. Her opinion of him changed abruptly when she realized that Tom and she were very much alike, even if it didn't look that way from the outside. He was just as enthusiastic about the accomplishment of the new government and believed in their justness as she did. His cheeky manner was just another expression of the same hunger for a just world that she also felt. Over time, they got to know each other better. Tom had had experiences similar to hers. The more they realized how similar they were, the more their affection for each other grew. Their initial dislike quickly turned into a deep love. Their similar past and shared ideals connected them. An almost inseparable relationship developed. But eventually it too came to an end, Patricia realized bitterly. So this was a short excerpt in which I tell about this relationship between Patricia and Tom, so the background of it, and Tom will occur later in the novel. So if you want to find more about how this works out, what's happening between them, then I encourage you to buy the book, to read it, so you can get it on Amazon. And if you liked it, then I really encourage you to write a review. This just helps other readers to get to know the book and to know if this book is something for them too. Episode 43, What a Coincidence. So when we are talking about coincidence or random chance, it begs the question what we mean by that. What is this? Is there something like coincidences, things that occur just probabilistically? It seems to be so. Let's see what science has to tell us about that. So in most scientific disciplines, except for quantum mechanics, it is coincidences or random chance comes in because the system is too complex to describe it accurately or to describe it in an easy way. For example, if you just look at statistical physics, there you have the case that they are just the statistical physics is basically for example, the room in which you are sitting is basically there are many bajillion particles flying around, and just to describe what each of them is doing is just way too complex, way too difficult. But you don't need to, because you can approximate the behavior that is happening there. You can go into statistics, see what statistically it's happening, basically under the consideration that there is random chance, that you not that there is random chance, but basically that you consider the behavior of the particles to be random, that they're randomly flying around and so on. And with this, you can get quantities like temperature and so on to describe this system. This is basically how random chances or statistics or stochastics is used in science or in scientific disciplines. And there it is basically the problem is not that there is really random processes occurring, that really the particles are randomly flying around. It's just that it appears this way. It's just that the system is so complex that for us to describe it in a way where we have this all in a deterministic way, where we understand that there are no random chance, that there are no probabilities, nothing like this, but they all react to the interactions that they have with each other, it would be way too difficult, and it also would not be necessary, because it completely suffices to know what is the temperature in the room, what is all these quantities, the pressure and so on, these quantities that we can extract from this statistical and kind of statistical describing the system, instead of describing it accurately, perfectly deterministically, because we actually, what we need to know of some room, for example, in which we are sitting, is usually, okay, what's the temperature, what's the pressure, and so on. We don't actually need to know what each individual particle is doing there, in which direction it is going, which speed it has, and so on. So therefore, it is not just that the system is complex and we just cannot solve it, but it's also that we don't need to solve it because we don't need to know the system in that much detail. So another example that you maybe know from your everyday life, and which is the basic thing that is attributed to random chance, is basically the throwing of a dice. So rolling a dice is usually considered to be a probabilistic event, but if you look into the really science and the mechanics of it, it's actually not random at all. So if I'm rolling a dice and I know the frequency with which I shake my hand, I know the height from which the dice will fall, I know its initial conditions, I know its weight, and all these data that I would need to have, then I really, in principle, I can then compute at which number it will fall upon. So I can really compute which it would be. However, of course, as I know, this is also much too complicated. It is, I think, easier than to describe all the particles in one room, but it's still very complicated. It's very hard to even get these data, to get a frequency by which I shake my hand. This is not really that easy. So it's hard to do. It's hard to predict. But in principle, it would be possible. In principle, it is not a random event in a sense that it's completely random, that there is no deterministic attribute to it. But it is random in a sense that it is too complex to predict, and especially for our brains, for us in our head to compute it, is much too complicated, especially in a short time that it would need for me to know, okay, how do I have to throw my dice such that I get the number that I want. And because of this, it's of course possible to use it for games where you really want to have this randomness included, because it's you are, as a user, usually you are not able to cheat this system. And in quantum mechanics, this is, however, different. Because in quantum mechanics, it is the fact that even if you look into individual particles, the behavior of individual particles, their behavior is described by probabilities, by real probabilities, by random chance. So you cannot anymore say how a particle will behave, but you can only give a probability whether it will behave in a certain way. Or to say it more clearly, if you do a measurement, then you know where the particle is, you can, or what you have measured about a particle, then you know this quantity. But what happens between the measurements you can only set a probability of what you would measure the particle to, what state you would measure the particle to be in if you would measure it at this certain point in time. So here it seems that this probabilistic nature is really inherent to the particle, that it is not that the system is too complex for us to describe, but that this is really an inherent part of these particles, an inherent part of nature, and therefore this differs from these other disciplines where random chance is basically included as kind of in kind of an and try to make these equations or make these predictions easier. However, it's still not completely understood what random chance actually is. What is this? How is it determined? Or if it, random chance is basically defined to not be determined, to be that there is a randomness, that there is something that you cannot determine beforehand in it included. But how is this to understand? How does this work? And so on, that there is no real way to grasp that, to understand that, and therefore it is still also not understand yet. But this concept of random chance has been around for some time. Since people could thought or could talk about things, they were talking about random chance, because everyone experienced events that appeared randomly to them, that they appeared to be either lucky or unlucky to them. And even already the Romans were talking about this. For example, they had this saying where they had also a deity which they used to describe this. So there was this deity Fortuna, which was basically the god of luck, or fortune, of destiny and so on. And whether it depended on whether this deity was in favor of you or not. On this it depended whether you had a lucky life or lucky circumstances or not. And in this context, the Romans said, had this saying of fortune favors the brave, was what basically means that the brave people basically that fortune, so this deity of fortune would favor them. So for example, Julius Caesar was also convinced of that, and was putting this to the many battles he fought, and it seemed to actually have been true, because he in most of his battles he was outnumbered, and therefore it seemed that his courage, his bravery to still fight with his men was something that fortune favored, and hence they won. Of course, here you can argue that this was not really the case, that basically because Julius Caesar was also a great tactician and a strategist of war, he maybe because of that he succeeded, although he was in many cases outnumbered. But this was what he was saying, and this was what the Romans were believing. Today you oftentimes hear kind of different statements. Today you rather hear that fortune is in some sense also worked for, that you work for it, or and there the logic behind it is that because you try again, especially in sports, if you say, okay, I train, I learn, I try again, and if then in the game I get a lucky shot, then it's not because I'm so lucky, but it is because I was really beforehand training, and just as a rule of statistics, it then happens that I get lucky when I'm doing my shot and so on. But also that I sometimes get not lucky, but sometimes get lucky. But by increasing basically the times I do this and so on, I also increase the chance of things working out and so on. So this is basically the reasoning behind this. But as you can see, in every culture there was this awareness of this fortune or random chance or of this thing happen, and we found different ways to deal with this, to think of this. And I think the question is random chance real, or is there some interpretation of it? In faith, can we find an interpretation of this? So I think if we relate it to faith, there we will also oftentimes see it in cases where, for example, a person just barely escaped death and so on. Then there we can ask, okay, was this fortunate? Was this providence? What was behind that? And this is oftentimes what we ask ourselves then. Was this, for example, if one barely escaped death or almost died because of some almost accident or something, then you might ask, okay, was this God protecting me? Was I just lucky? What happened there? And I think in some sense we can see it this way, but we also have to consider that, for example, there are also many random events or seemingly random events that turn out pretty negatively. And then you would also say, okay, if God protected this person in that situation, did he punish this person in this situation, or what is going on here? And I think there needs to be a broader explanation of this. So one thing that I heard state, oftentimes it's attributed to Albert Einstein, but I do not believe that he said it. But the statement itself is still interesting, and this is coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. So basically, it states that God uses coincidence or seeming coincidence to remain anonymous, so that we don't see his working in this world because it looks random to us. So is this actually true? And I think, as I said, yeah, it might be true, or to some degree, but what is then with negative random chances? Is he also behind this? And I do not think that this is the case, but I think, as we know from the Bible, as we know from Scripture, there's not only God, but he has also an adversary, the devil, who is working against him. And therefore, you could also say that these negative random chances are kind of the ways of this adversary to remain anonymous. And it depends on who has more power over a person, basically, which happens more. But I think this still not describes it completely. And I think we need to also consider that random chance and coincidence in quantum mechanics, as I have stated several times on this podcast, this is what gives us the way to be this gives us a way for free will. So this gives science a realm in which free will can basically exist, or an understanding that free will could be possible, because the world is not deterministic, and therefore there might be something like free will. So this fact of random chance in nature seems to give way to something like free will to exist. And then you need to ask yourself, okay, what is actually free will? How could you, for example, distinguish something like free will from random chance? And the answer is you couldn't, because you cannot understand free will. You cannot say, okay, free will is basically not being determined by some outset. It's being free in your choice. And the same is true for random chance. Random chance means not being set by the outside said, but something random can happen anytime. So you actually could not distinguish free will from random chance, and therefore you could basically say that random chance might be or could be yielded back to something like free will of people, that free decisions of people can would seem arbitrary, would seem like random chance, and maybe there is a connection between that. And I think what we need to understand is that there is this really occurring fact of random chance that might be influenced by free will, by our decisions, and that might also be influenced by providence of God, and also by negative plans of the adversary of God, and so on. But I think the important part is to not put this into a perspective that only good things happening to the good and only bad things to the bad, and so on, because here the scripture is also pretty clear. And because it says in Matthew 5 verse 45, it says that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So these seemingly random things or fortunate things like rain, it says here, are put to the righteous and the unrighteous. So there is some certain randomness or some certain providence for those, the good and the bad, that God provides. And therefore it is not a case that you can say, okay, it's just good things happening to the good and bad things happening to the bad. But I think it's kind of that everyone is getting it in the same way, but there is a divine providence, and there is God helping us out of if something negative happens to us. But also we need to understand that God is not the one who brings these negative things. So the random chance is there also kind of included, and this is also kind of the fact that we live in a fallen world in which this can manifest itself, and it seems random to us because we cannot describe it scientifically, we cannot understand it in this deterministic way, but it is actually not random in this sense, but it is just kind of this undescribable feature, or scientifically undescribable feature, which depends on different quantities, I would say, which depends in some sense on our free will, and in at large on the collective free will of everyone. So the consequences of this collective free will, if you would say, or this collective consequences of the free will of each individual, and so on. And I think on many things, and I think you cannot really get a complete picture what leads to this random chance, but I think you have to understand that the fact that random chance seems to be in this universe, that it seems to not be something where we cannot describe it as in quantum mechanics, where it is really intrinsic in nature. This shows that there is something like free will, and this free will is to some degree responsible for these random events, or can be attributed to it. And whether this is can be completely attributed to it, or whether there is really some completely random things, this I'm not sure yet. I think we will never completely understand it, but I think random chance and coincidence, this is a mystery that we cannot solve scientifically, and I think answers like coincidence is God's way of staying anonymous, and the fact that free will is indistinguishable from random chance, and therefore we could basically say that in some sense random chance shows that there is free will, or is maybe even in some sense equivalent to that. So I think these are interesting ideas, and I think interesting ways to look at it and see that random chance is not so random after all. Episode 44. Why are we searching for meaning? So this is kind of a new episode or new kind of episode. I thought in these preview episodes that I'm doing, I want to try to close these episodes always with some kind of more, not really philosophical, maybe even kind of like a sermon episode where I just talk about things that I'm thinking about right now, or that I find interesting, or that I think are meaningful, or things to really think about, or really meditate on, or just let them move, let yourself be moved by them. And just let me know what you think of them, so you can just write to me. If you know my Substack, you can write me at substack.scifaith.com. There you can also subscribe to my stuff, and you can write me messages there if you have a Substack account. And I would really like to get to know, hear from you what you think about this new concept, whether you like it, whether not, or what I can improve of it. So just let me know. I will just try it out and see where it goes. And today I want to talk about, this whole preview episode is called The Meaning of Meaning. So what do I mean by that? So actually it's, so I want to little bit to talk about why are we searching for a meaning? What might be pitfalls in this quest, or in this longing for meaning in our lives? And how did I came about it to this? I think what oftentimes interests me is what do people long for, or what is the thing that especially successful people, what pushes them, especially if they are unbelievers. Then I, as a believer, as somebody who is really driven by this. By his faith, by getting to know God, getting to get a deeper understanding of God and His nature and His being, I always try to understand if people are driven in the same way, kind of, or even more, most likely, but not for something like that, but for something completely else, in a way that they put really many hours of their day, of their lives into it, and bring huge sacrifices for that. Then I really oftentimes am interested to try to understand, or to get to understand what is driving them, why are they doing this, and so on. And I think especially interesting in this regard, I found Elon Musk, because he is apparently not driven by money or by personal gains or something like that. Not to make him more moral than he is, but if you just hear what he's saying about what drives him, what puts him, brought him to this business ideas that he had, and so on, what drives him to build these businesses, these many different businesses, and get more and more responsibility of it, and so on, then you see that this is not kind of money or something like that, but kind of that he's looking for some meaning. He's trying to find meaning in his life. And he told in one interview, I heard him talk, that he thinks this meaning that the man is searching for is to be found in scientific progress. He almost called it kind of like a religion, something like that science needs to progress, to find progress in science, and basically in the end this would lead to finding the complete truth or something like that. I might misphrase what he completely said, or maybe I use what I understand him to say, or say what I understand him to say. But what I'm thinking, or what I was thinking when I heard him talking about this, is that this is not an end in itself. Because if you say, okay, the end is scientific progress, no, progress is also leading somewhere. So this is not an end of it in itself. So it cannot be the final goal. It cannot be the final meaning. So even though this seems to be the one for him, according to my logic, or how I thought of it, this cannot be the final thing. This cannot be the final meaning behind it all. It can only maybe be the way to this meaning, but it cannot be the final meaning. And I also think scientific progress in itself is not the way to finally arrive at a final meaning, because I think there is more necessary for it, as I often talk about it in this podcast. And I think what you see from there, I mean, people like Elon Musk, who they are really driven by that, and they do not tend to deviate from this drive. They say, okay, this is the meaning that I have for my life, and they are driven by that. And even if it's other people who are more driven by like just more success or financial success, by getting that, they are driven in this way. But I think that the trap you can fall in there is that the meaning is basically not the real meaning, basically, not the real meaningful meaning, and then you are basically kind of in a hamster wheel, and you're running around and basically for nothing, which is basically what I think many of these meanings that people put their life to is, because it's not an end in itself. It's not a final thing that we are longing for. And this longing for meaning, as you can see, this is put into our identity. Everyone's longing for meaning, and therefore you can see that there has to be a real meaning in this world. Because if you look at it even if you look at it from evolution, then you will see the same thing, because you will see that we have eyes because there was light to see, and therefore we have eyes. So in an evolutionary sense, you would say we developed eyes because there was light for us to see, and therefore we developed it. And in a similar way we developed our other senses and so on, because there was something to be sensed. And in the same way, therefore, you would have to say, okay, we are longing for meaning, we are searching for meaning, because there is actually something like meaning. So life actually has a meaning. There is meaning to life. Otherwise, we would not search for it. Otherwise, we would not have this longing for it. So from this, you can already see that we really long from the fact that we long for meaning, you can really see that there is a meaning, to life. And therefore, all these kinds of ideas of life having no meaning, basically, this can basically not be. So what is the real meaning? I think this is then important. I think the trap can then be to look for a meaning just that you have this longing fulfilled, this longing or this search for a meaning, and you just give you any meaning, and then this is fulfilled, and then you are content. But this is kind of like using a drug to get this kick that you are looking for. This is also not really the way to go. It's just tricking you around it, and in the end will lead to more problems than solutions, because you will get addicted to it. And I think here the same thing occurs. If you have this kind of fake meaning that you use to get this longing for meaning fulfilled, then this is kind of cheating yourself, or fooling yourself. And therefore I think this is not the solution. It's not just to say, okay, I find any meaning for my life, I look for just any meaning in my life, and then this will fulfill my longing for a deeper meaning, and therefore I will be happy this way. This cannot be the final goal. This cannot be the thing that really will work in the end. And therefore I think it is important to not just find any meaning in our lives, but to find the meaning of our lives. And the question, of course, then is, what is the meaning of our lives? What does it all mean? What are we here for? What does it mean? And I think there is this meaning that we can look for, as I have shown from even this evolutionary viewpoint, that there has to be meaning in life. And I think it's important to find this, or to get to the real meaning of life, in order to live this fulfilled life where we really are living according to the meaning of our lives. And as I of course believe, this is to be found in Jesus. This is to be found in the Word of God. This is to be found in knowing God, into getting to know God in a deeper way, in a deeper level. And this is, I think, the way to go. And I think if this is the meaning of our life, then we will come into the full fulfillment of our lives, and therefore we will from there we can go into all the other things. There we can go into scientific progress. We can go into science and learn how God reveals himself in science, and this will make science progress. And as I have mentioned many times, especially in the podcast to the scientific method, I believe this will even increase the scientific progress to its highest measure, and so on. And if we go from out of there, from this real meaning, into all the other things in which people today find some meaning, then the meaning that people find there will just be magnified, because we are coming from the true meaning, if you understand what I'm saying by this. And what's also interesting about this, and what we think also need to acknowledge from this, is that any philosophy, any viewpoint, any also interpretation of a scientific theory that denies this meaning, that denies that life has some meaning, and that says everything is just a product of random chance without any design and so on, it might be that these theories are factually true, that the facts turn out to be factually true, so really there in nature, but still, you from the thoughts we had before here, you still know that this cannot be the full truth. That the interpretation, the worldview that this theory or this look at life brings, that this has to be wrong, because we would not be searching for meaning if we were just meaningless products of some evolutionary process. If this were just the case, some meaningless evolutionary process, and we would be the result of that, then we wouldn't be people who are looking for a meaning in this world, because in our DNA it would be basically intrinsically implied that there is no meaning, so why would we look for one? And then the world, I think, would look a lot of completely different. And from this we know that all these interpretations can actually not be true. And when I look at science and at scientific discoveries and at scientific theories, I don't look from a viewpoint of it's all the truth, of course, and so on. I also don't look from a viewpoint, okay, which is in accordance to my faith and what is not. But actually, I look from this point of, okay, I know that there has to be meaning in this life. What agrees with that and what does not agree with it. And I don't discount theories that do have factually accurate results but do not support this worldview. I discount them in the way that I say, okay, their interpretation cannot be right, and therefore there needs to be something done on this theory to make it completely right. And I also believe if this interpretation is not right, this needs to be represented somewhere in the data. So if you would study them closely, you will soon, I think, find that there are gaps in this theory, or there are things that it doesn't predict or that it wrongly predicts. So they will sooner or later be falsified, I believe. But as long as they work, and as long as they are the best theories for the things that we need to describe, as long as they can be considered to be factually correct, but still then I would consider their interpretation to be not this correct, because I know from this standpoint that I know there is meaning to life. I know that they cannot be correct because they basically deny that. And this is, I think, a healthy way of looking at scientific theories, where you do not deny the scientific results, where you do not deny them, but still you have a viewpoint from which you can distinguish between which scientific theories, or especially the interpretation of which scientific theories you consider to be accurate, and which one you think there needs to be some improvement. And this helps you also to find where do you need to look for improvement or for better ways to describe it. If you look from this standpoint of faith, which I often argue in this podcast also, that if you do science on a foundation of faith, that this will be way more productive than the other way around. And this is basically what I mean by this, that you know from your faith, from your convictions, that you know what is true and what the interpretation of these theories therefore have to reflect. And from there, if there's a theory that describes nature rather well but still has not this interpretation, then there has to be a better theory. That you just know because of this fact. And this is the way I look at science, and this is, I think, a really healthy way to look at science, because you do not deny any scientific facts, but still you know where interpretations might be different according to your beliefs, and where there might be a way to improve. And then you can also see, basically check your beliefs on that, because if there is no improvement in these theories, if these theories turn out to be rock solid, then you might also check your biases. That's completely true. But still, you're working from conviction, from belief, from faith, and towards what you see in this world, what you see in nature, and not the other way around. Actually, I think nobody is really coming from the other way around, because I think these theories of evolution without any kind of design and so on mostly come from people who actually believe that the world is this way. So it's really this worldview that defines what you believe to be the truth, what you also then believe to be reflected in science, which also shapes your way of constructing theories. And therefore, you will automatically construct theories such that they are in accordance to your own personal beliefs. But if we really want to come to a theory, or to the best theories that describe science best, I think the way to do this is to really have our beliefs straight, to know what we believe, and from there move into, okay, what does this say about which interpretation should our theories have, and from there get them to agree with the data that we do have. And I think from there we can really find theories that will describe nature to its fullest and in the most accurate way. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.